Welcome back. Dean Van Slyke, if you'd bring your panel out onto the stage. Moderating this next discussion is David Van Slyke. Dave is the Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs here at Syracuse University and the Banel Chair in Business and Government Policy. Dean Van Slyke is a current member of the Defense Business Board and a former director and fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. Dave's academic accomplishments are too many for me to name here, but it is to say that his work has and continues to have impact and inform senior leaders in government, the nonprofit sector, and in business. Welcome, Dave, and I'll ask you to, in turn, introduce your panel.
Great. Mike, thank you so much, and delighted to see everyone here today. We have such an esteemed panel that if I went through their full biographies, we would then be at the question and answer time. To my immediate right is President Armacost, Andy Armacost. He's the president of the University of North Dakota. He is a retired Air Force Brigadier General. We're thinking about journalists so much. He has 30 years of service, 19 years at the Air Force Academy, where he was a colleague of Vice Chancellor Haney's. In addition to being a faculty member in the Department of Management, you were also the dean at the time. Next to President Armacost is President Bodner of the University of Montana. As you've already heard Dr. Armstrong reference, President Bodner is playing, I think, junior to Dr. Armstrong on the Army baseball team. He's a graduate of the United States Military Academy, was a Rhodes Scholar, a former Army infantry officer in Green Beret. He also taught at the United States Military Academy in the Department of Economics and is also a former executive at General Electric. Next to President Bodner is President Ted Carter. He is the president of the University of Nebraska System. He's a retired Navy Vice Admiral with 38 years of service. Interestingly, though, he's one of the only individuals to serve both as the superintendent of the United States Naval Academy, as well as the former president of the Naval War College. And so I suspect he has some interesting data and experiences to share relative to what we heard Secretary Rosker talk a little bit about before with respect to academies, OCS, and ROTC. And finally, next to President Carter is President Mel Stith. Mel Stith is an Army Vietnam veteran and was an intelligence officer. Mel is pretty interesting, very unique in the sense of received his undergraduate degree from Norfolk State and returned many years later to be the president of Norfolk State. He received his MBA and PhD here at Syracuse University from the Whitman School of Management, to which he returned to be the dean of the Whitman School. And he was one of the key influencers in supporting Vice Chancellor Haney and others in launching the Institute for Veterans and Military Families. So to each of our presidents, thank you so much for joining us today. This panel is focused on collaboration versus competition. What are the common challenges that make us better together? Our purpose today on this panel is to really initiate a cross-sector conversation on the shared challenges facing both DoD and higher education, and more broadly, citizenship and public service. You won't be surprised to know, as the Dean of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, I've been heartened to hear so much conversation, not just about military service and public service, but national service with an orientation to community impact for the public good. We have a few objectives that we're going to try to talk about today and surface. Those talk about the intersecting nature of the future challenges facing higher education and the department, building a value proposition for collaboration, and unearthing some of the potential downsides of competition. Really trying to get at some of those myths, misconceptions, and stereotypes of military-connected students in higher education. And I have a little story I want to share about that. And to elevate the potential opportunities for innovation. That is, how do we think differently about the relationship between DoD and higher ed, both across a continuum of in-service and post-service engagement. I think it's been encouraging already as these conversations have moved forward to think about progress, at least in terms of raising the visibility and discussion about post-service opportunities. We had so many good speakers already today that a lot of my framing comments no longer need to be made. So one of the things I want to talk about is how do we get to some concrete actions and commitments from our university leaders, and finding greater opportunities for alignment around human capital, education, and talent development, both within the department and our different service branches. But before we begin, I want each of the presidents to tell you just a little bit about what brought them here and their institutions today. And President Stith, maybe we can start with you first.
Well, good morning. It's great to be part of a university that cares so much about veterans. My story is pretty simple. Growing up in the 60s, my family owned a family farm in a little town called Jarrett, Virginia, that's still looking for its first stoplight. And I went to Norfolk State. And remember then, if you had a land-grant school, the first 2 years of ROTC was mandatory. So every winter we put on our heavy green wool uniforms and marched around campus. And at the end of those 2 years, you could have an option to go into advanced ROTC or not. So I was nominated to be the first kid from Norfolk State to be eligible for a ROTC scholarship. I got that scholarship. It was $100 a month, and I was one of 10 kids in my dad's family, so I got off his payroll and was the richest kid on campus with that $100 a month, and they paid for all of my housing, books, and everything. So it was quite a feat for me to be able to do that. And then my other 9 brothers and sisters joined me in getting college degrees. And then after that, I was commissioned quickly into the Armor. But then I was at Fort Knox and got a call, said, Lieutenant Stith, you need to come and get your bags. You've been selected to help integrate the Military Intelligence Command. You're on your way to Fort Hollerberg, Maryland, and Dundalk, Fort Hollerberg and Dundalk, Maryland. Went there, and then Vietnamese language school in service in Vietnam. And then back early dropped to Syracuse to go to graduate school here to get my MBA. And the professor asked me, he said, you should stay and get your PhD. And that got me then coming back years later to be the dean of the Whitman School was quite an honor. And a young professor named Mike Haney came to my office one day and said, we need to do something to help veterans. And I said, okay. And he laid out this program. And on the way out, he said, oh, by the way, and I wanted to be free for them. You meet the rest of money. My friend Tom Foley was here. We went out and raised that money because as a veteran, and I knew what the sacrifices veterans have made, and you heard about it this morning, it was just something I knew that Syracuse history, we had the Army Controllership Program in Whitman at that time, and other great programs in Newhouse and Maxwell, that Syracuse would be the perfect place to launch our programs to change the way we perceive veterans on college campuses.
Now, thank you so much. President Carter?
So first of all, I want to say thank you to Syracuse and Tennessee for putting on an amazing event, and very humbling to be on the stage here with my fellow colleagues and military veterans. I grew up in a small town in Rhode Island. Had the privilege of attending the U.S. Naval Academy, first from my town in its history, and I had no clue what I was going into because I didn't really have that much military background in my family. Upon graduation, I had kind of 3 phases of my 38-year military career. Vast majority at Carrier Aviation. I flew Phantoms, Tomcats, and Super Hornets all the way up until I was a 2-star admiral. I went to Top Gun when they were filming the original movie, and was part of that scene at Miramar during the height of the Top Gun mystique. The second part of my career was as a nuclear engineer, and that was my path to eventually command a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson. The third part of my career was a reluctant one for me. I wanted to stay operational. As Bernie, the secretary, was talking about educational opportunities, I was that officer that kept wanting to go to the PG school, and the Navy kept saying, no, it'll hurt your career. So I never did. I attended all the military schools, all on my own time and at sea, and then I was asked to lead the U.S. Naval War College. And I told the CNO that I had no background in doing that whatsoever. And he said, that's exactly why you should go do it. I only had a chance to do that for a year in my home state of Rhode Island up in Newport, the oldest war college in the world. And then I was asked to lead the U.S. Naval Academy. Title 10 directs that that's a 3-year tour, and then you're supposed to retire. I ended up staying there for 5 years. It was the longest continuous service to the U.S. Naval Academy since the Civil War, and I loved it. I wanted to be in higher ed upon retirement in 2019. I found it very difficult because, as a lot of you know, you have to be invited. And Nebraska found me. I'm a non-traditional university system president, and I'm very, very encouraged by what I've heard here today. And I'll tell you, the state of Nebraska is an amazing place because they really do embrace their veterans. And I get to be the chief spokesperson as a military veteran to tell some of these stories and why the intersection of military service and higher ed matters so much.
Ted, thank you so much. President Bodnar?
Well, thank you, David. And I want to echo everyone's thanks to Syracuse and the entire team here for bringing together this conversation. You know, like many, the military was a path to an education for me, a path to a career, the career that was in the military, private sector, now in public higher ed. At an institution that's squarely focused on quality, but also access. A third of our students are Pell eligible, slightly higher percentage than that are first-generation college students. Education remains that pathway, and I think, you know, you talk about, well, what brings you here? What brings you here to this summit? You know, I'm really compelled by what the IVMF has done, but this conversation about how we think about education and national security. I think great points this morning talking about the military itself. Is very important discussion. I would argue, though, the largest national security problem that not enough of us are talking about is the declining rates of educational attainment in this country right now. You look at, you know, when Nick and I were at West Point, I think the U.S. ranked third among OECD nations in terms of proportion of citizens who have a college degree. I think we're now 12th, somewhere around that. You look at throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, steadily increasing rates of college attendance, 50% in 1980 to 60% in 1990, up to 70% by the late 2000s. Kind of hovered there around until 2016, and we've seen a drop back down to 60%. And having taught economics at West Point, you know, we always talked about, you know, economic growth. You know, there's not that many factors that go into it: land, labor, capital, business formation. And you look at this country's human capital stock and what is happening right now if we don't reverse this declining trend. I mean, it's again, we could delve more into that, but I'm obviously very interested in how we think about the you know, very direct kind of first order effects of military readiness and education, but the second and third order effects on our innovation economy. You know, we're all comfortable. Hold up your Apple products that says, you know, assembled in China, but designed and formulated in California or somewhere in the U.S. We're okay with that, right? It's okay if other countries assemble as long as we're coming up with those ideas. Well, innovation requires education, and that's important for DoD. It's important for the health of our broader national security. And so I think these conversations are very much related, and we as a higher ed sector have to adapt.
Seth, thank you so much. President Armacost?
I will echo everybody's comments about our appreciation to Syracuse and Tennessee for hosting and putting this forum together. It's been a remarkable morning so far, and we hope to add to that. My background is as the son of a military person as well. My dad was in the Coast Guard for 20 years, Coast Guard Academy graduate. My brother served in the Air Force. He entered 2 years ahead of me. So it was, as we heard earlier, that connection, that family connection was certainly alive and well in my family. My career ended up, I'm an operations research analyst, not as exciting as being a naval aviator at Top Gun, but for those who love math, it's a really good place to be. But my way found me to the Air Force Academy as a faculty member, as a department chair, and then ultimately the dean of the faculty, which is the provost. And through that, I can't think of a better way to combine serving the academy and serving the academy than serving in a role like that. And through two prominent alumni of the Air Force Academy, as I was retiring, they made me aware of a position opening up at the University of North Dakota. And so this was in the summer of 2019. And so I interviewed for the position. I knew that a presidency was something we would be highly interested in. And the preparation at the Air Force Academy certainly set me up well, I believe. So I've been there. I'm what we call a pandemic president. Showed up on June 1st of 2020, right smack dab in the middle of the start of the pandemic, and certainly challenges there. People asked, of course, I thought you probably thought it was all going to be fun, but as we all know, you don't get selected for leadership positions to only lead during the fun times. You lead during the challenging times as well. And I was fortunate to join a team that was absolutely incredible, a well-unified team that led us through the pandemic. North Dakota is a state that is a very military-friendly state. The University of North Dakota boasts just over 10%, between 10 and 11% of our students are actually military or military affiliated. It's a significant percentage, and yet we also see those interesting boundaries that exist. Not a full understanding of the military, in spite of being military friendly. A great example is when I interviewed, people said, well, how are you going to make the jump from military leadership to university leadership? What they don't understand is military leadership comprises all those features of leadership that apply across the board. The Hollywood image, or we heard it earlier, the entertainment version of a military leader or a military member is not accurate. And so one thing we all can do is bind together to make sure the narrative of what it means to serve, both as officers and enlisted members, and also civilian members of the Department of Defense. How do we tell that story, and how do we share the meaning that we bring to our lives as servants?
Thank you so much, Andy. Ted, Seth set us up in talking about some of the shared needs and challenges between higher ed and DoD, and I think our audience would benefit from hearing the perspectives of this panel, and I want to start with you because of your unique role spanning three kinds of institutions: the formal training of young officers, the training of mid-career officers, sometimes with continued longevity, sometimes almost ready to get out, and now leading a system, not just one particular institution, but an entire system. When you think about some of those human capital requirements and the commonalities between both the military and higher ed, what do you see as some of those shared needs and challenges that we should be thinking about?
Well, when I was transitioning, and I still recall going into my first interview for the University of Nebraska, a question was posed to me, are you prepared to leave, leading an institution of 4,400 of some of the best and brightest that would go to a service academy like the Naval Academy, and then come to a system that has 50,000 students where none of them will be of that quality? And I was like, are you kidding me? That's a real question. You think that's what the perception of what you have here? And I found it to be, and I said I don't believe it, and I can validate after being there, I'm in my fourth year, that is absolutely not true. The students are at the University of Nebraska, just as here at Syracuse or Tennessee or wherever you're representing. And as Ash mentioned, this generation does have a sense of service. And I see that at Nebraska, I've seen it at other institutions. So that part makes me very proud. As Seth just mentioned, though, we do have a challenge. I mean, the numbers are declining. Enrollment's a challenge everywhere. We're not immune from that in the Midwest. Although our percentages down are relatively minor, our flagship is doing okay. But I think the most important thing to state on this topic is, as we're looking over the horizon at what we've got to do, there's always been this tendency that we don't move our ships very fast. We don't tend to be very dynamic in how we have to affect change to make sure that we understand that our students are no longer a product, they're the customer. And I use the analogy often within our system that as big and as onerous as a nuclear-powered 100,000-ton water displacement aircraft carrier seems, it's actually quite nimble. It can turn 360 degrees in less than 2 minutes. If we can move a ship that big, that fast through the water, we ought to be able to move higher ed similarly. The pandemic actually was an accelerant for us. As much as it's changed, how we viewed education, some discussion was already made about kind of the modalities that we've had to learn and adjust to, whether it be synchronous, asynchronous, remote, in person. We've had to make some immediate changes, and I used the pandemic at Nebraska as an opportunity to affect change. We not only froze tuition throughout the entire pandemic, we changed the academic calendar for the first time in 100 years. I changed the cost of online education to match what it cost in person, knowing that most students, in fact, almost 100% of our 50,000 students take some portion of an online course. And of course, as we're talking about military, we want to make sure we were the most welcoming for military veterans and their families. We have Offutt Air Force Base, we have a very large Air National Guard, and I'm proud of the fact, and I don't take any credit for this, we've improved our engagement with our military 2 to 3% per year since the pandemic. We now, just as Andy mentioned, we're about 10% of our 50,000 students are either retired, active, or an immediate family member attending our programs. And you might say, how is that? How did you do that? Because we made ourselves the most affordable, high-value program, and we have state legislation, just as the state of Tennessee has done, that now makes Nebraska a very military-friendly state. So we've still got more work to do, but this idea that we better be ready for change, because we are at an intersection in higher ed, and we've got to have this conversation about what the value of higher education is, because we're in a little bit of a battle for that in this country, that competition for talent. And I believe as the enrollment for the service academies, as the enlistment for the military is a little bit challenged, that the solution set has to be done in parallel. I think they can be a solution set for both.
Ted, that's really helpful. And Andy, you had just begun to talk a little bit about, the fictionalization of the average soldier, sailor, or airman. And, when you think about some of these shared needs and challenges, are there other myths that we have to bust in terms of how we think about moving away from a monolithic view of a military student and having perhaps a more expansive understanding of how they actually strengthen inclusion and diversity on campus?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that, I know when I first showed up at UND, there was a top 10 list of things faculty members should do when they work with veterans. And one of them was something like avoid loud noises. And what that illustrated to me was, again, you talk about a monolithic view. What we're really trying to emphasize is the individual need of each student. Some have seen combat and very well might have a negative reaction to loud noises. Many don't. And so really stressing the individual needs of these individual students is important. At the same time, we need to have programs on campus that align with the interests both of the individual veterans or service members, but also the interests of the services themselves. And so careful discussion with services. We have a partnership with the U.S. Space Force where we're aligning our programs, now getting into, we just launched an aerospace engineering program as well as satellite design and launch, and really to tie to those needs. So we have to listen to the individual members, but also broadly to the services as well to make sure the programs we're offering. And then at every possible turn, we tell the stories of the veterans and the stories of these programs and how we hope to contribute to national security under this national security initiative.
That's super. Mel, sometimes people talk about barriers to collaboration between the military and higher ed. And you're uniquely positioned at having led in two very different types of institutions, one an HBCU and one a private. And sometimes when we talk about barriers to collaboration, we don't always think about, we might ask what are the smart practices that we should employ, but we're not always looking at kind of analogs or pattern recognition, right? Do you see, what were some of the barriers to collaboration that you saw in your leadership experiences in higher ed, and how did you find pathways to breaking those down?
Okay, it's real interesting because Norfolk State University, I'll talk about that, and Ted, as you know, is in the heart of the Navy. But it's also surrounded by the Coast Guard, Army bases, Fort Houston, Fort Monroe, just a military orientation. And when we get to campus, we were so concentrated as an HBCU on getting fresh generation educated kids through college, and we focused because I had a huge Army ROTC on the Army. So when I got there, we started collaborating with the Coast Guard and then making the campus easier for veterans to come to, not only the veterans, but their spouses. Because in the Navy, like the Army, many times, if the spouse is traditionally, it's the lady who has the kids, but she wants to go to school as well. So we start collaborating, making it very easy, whether it's through online education or oftentimes on campus where these folks could come. But the one I liked the most was with the Coast Guard. And it was something as simple as swimming. Many of the young African Americans coming couldn't swim to meet the standards that they wanted. And also in the STEM, in the mathematical area, some of these kids got in late for their Cal 1, Cal 2. And so we said, look, let's rethink what this degree means. Let's invest in these kids. So we took the first year, and what we said was, Norfolk State will pay for the room and board and the housing. You pay for the tuition and get them into the STEM areas, get them into the quant areas, and then let them take that 5th year to be able to then come into the Coast Guard. And we started having all kind of success with those students then looking at a pathway in the Coast Guard. And then some of the other areas came to us because what was happening, the HBCUs, maybe 13 of these institutions that we don't take full advantage of from a military and a civilian perspective. And Norfolk NATO is headquartered there. So we started building international internships for these kids to go to Belgium, to go to different places, to have a different kind of experience, and to come back to talk about service and being civilians and thinking about the government as career paths. Because remember, the young men and women that the military are trying to get in these STEM areas, the corporations are buying these kids off the college campuses. And they're buying them early through internships. And so it's a fierce competition. And because ROTC is no longer mandatory the first 2 years, the cores are much smaller on the campuses. So we saw this as a way to collaborate rather than say us versus them or challenges. And it has worked well on that campus. And Norfolk State has a huge, what we call alumni military group. And I'm a member of that group. We go back to campus, we talk to students about being in the military, what it meant to us, how it helped us to then to have opportunities to go to great graduate school like me, coming to Syracuse straight from Vietnam. And it just works. So we see it as a collaboration, I think, in the HBCU community. And the HBCUs, I have to tell you all, is hot. Our president from Dillard is here. She can tell you the enrollment is through the chain now. These smart young men and women are coming back to HBCUs. So there's an opportunity, I think, for the military to be on these campuses, to talk about the careers. And we go back at Norfolk State as a group. We have an alumni military day. And we go back, we're in the classes, whether it's a freshman or senior class, to talk to the young men and women about great careers and how the military can catapult you into great graduate schools and other kind of careers.
No, that's super helpful. Seth, you talked about 11% of your students having a veteran connection, but then you talked about some other sociodemographic and economic characteristics. Certain number first generation, Pell eligible, coming from marginalized communities. Sometimes, it's very, going to Andy's point about thinking about myths and stereotypes, we don't always think about Montana being a state with poverty and marginalized populations. What have been those barriers to collaboration that you've identified as president and as a veteran? And what are the ways in which you're trying to overcome those in the connectedness between the University of Montana and the military?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think there's maybe two separate topics that come together in terms of the implied actions we need to take. And I think there's the question of, how do we support veterans at the University of Montana and members of the I'll call it, broadly speaking, the military community. And I think one of the things, and Andy mentioned it, is this idea of, let's not otherize, if that's even a word, veterans. You hear us talk about, well, our veterans, like as this kind of weird group that's not part of our society. We need to honor our veterans. And I get that military service is concentrated now in this country at this time in such a small proportion of the population that it's hard not to do that. But our veterans are just normal people who come from our communities, and they have a different type of experience. I think, one of the reasons I thanked Sebastian Junger last night, because I think what he gets so right about members of the military is when they leave that loss of mission, that loss of community is so damaging for them. So for us, it's how do we create that community, and how do we enable veterans to continue to serve? That's the kind of default setting. I want to go be a part of something. I want to make a difference. I want to make an impact. I tell sometimes when fellow leaders at the university, when they get criticized, a hard question from a faculty member, I say, look, it's like you surprise a grizzly bear in Montana, it's going to charge, right? You present something to a faculty member, they're going to question it, right? You have a veteran, they're going to want to find a mission, right? If they don't have a mission, they get upset. So I think you have to create those opportunities for veterans to continue to serve. I think zooming back a little bit, when I think about, we have 7 tribal reservations in the state of Montana. We have a large rural population without access to education, a lot of them. And I think the things that we have to do a better job of, and this relates back to how we partner with DoD, is make pathways to higher ed more clear. I joke, but it's only half joking. I ended up at West Point in part because the FAFSA was so confusing that I was applying to Princeton and other schools, and it was like, I don't understand how I'm not getting more financial aid. My parents were rural school teachers. Well, West Point's free. It's the 90s. There's no wars. An officer must work in an office. A few trips to Iraq. I did not come from a military family. A few trips to Iraq later. That was not really the wisest decision. It was the right decision, but not the best informed. But there are so many barriers to accessing higher education. And then I think the second piece, and Secretary Rosker, I think, made a very good point in saying, and the point about broadening our aperture in terms of who we need to serve. It's not just those 18-year-olds who we need to recruit. We need to serve learners at all stages of their careers. And we need to provide, higher ed has to adapt to unbundle our offerings, to provide training in partnership with employers, including DoD, for people at all stages of their careers. And we don't typically do a very good job of that. So lots of ways we're doing it at the University of Montana, or trying to.
That's great. Andy, I'm going to say something provocative. I'm not sure if people are going to rush you or me, but sometimes we think of the Air Force as more innovative because of the close relationship to commercializable technology, to the ways in which we've seen warfare being, in some ways litigated in the geopolitical environment. So we think about these kinds of innovation, and sometimes we think to ourselves, well, there's more opportunities for partnerships. But I wonder, from your perspective, where do you see some of the shared goals between higher ed and DoD? And are there greater areas for alignment in a collaborative way that focus on innovation that are mutually beneficial?
There's a whole long list right here in front of me, but I won't go through it all. But absolutely, the opportunity for partnership exists in many ways, and it's not just between the DoD and higher ed. We just, Linwood came out, and Boeing generously announced a partnership with UND. So defense-related companies, of course, can offer a lot. The FAA has a partnership called the Vets to Wings program, which is being prototyped at UND as well. And so there's partners that exist beyond the bounds of just the two that you described, right, the DoD and higher ed. But let me focus on, you mentioned Air Force innovation. The Air Force acquisition process has actually gone through a pretty radical change over the last 5 or 6 years with the launch of what are called the Spark cells or AFWorks, which is our innovation cell. And I think there presents a huge opportunity for universities, which also have these types of innovation enterprises that are going on. And of course, Mike Haney has been involved in the Entrepreneurship Bootcamp for Veterans program. I think that's where it kind of started here for you, Mike. But there's even greater opportunities now for us to partner with local Air Force bases and Air Force bases across the nation to combine our entrepreneurship efforts with those of the Air Force. The same is true across the DoD, including the Defense Innovation Unit out in Silicon Valley. But it doesn't stop there. There's partnerships and innovations that can happen in the very funding process. Seth talked about the barriers. One of the biggest barriers, I think, to exiting veterans who are now pursuing education is how do you fund it? And so I think there's ample opportunity for us to work as higher ed in partnership with the DoD and the VA to come up with more efficient ways to execute the VA benefits. And I think some kind of consortium or study group to look at that would be really important. In addition, as veterans go out and potentially choose their post-Air Force or post-military careers, there's the DoD SkillBridge program, which you heard about earlier. Here, higher ed represents a huge opportunity, although individual universities might be prevented from participating because they can't commit, at least state schools can't commit to providing a 6-month internship with a guaranteed employment on the back end. But I think if higher ed collectively comes together and says, between all of us, thousands of schools, we can commit to veterans in a broader way. Perhaps that allows entry of individual universities into the SkillBridge program that they might have been prevented from participating in before. So there's a whole long list of items like this that I think collectively higher ed can come together and really influence how the DoD educates both its current workforce and also its veterans.
Mel, you had touched on some of that. You were giving some foresight to where there were areas of collaboration. You were trying to lower some of those barriers through some of that partnering. You were seeing the top of the funnel expand in terms of the number of students who are now perhaps better equipped to consider whether military service might be something on their horizon. Were you seeing and are you seeing other areas for innovation? Andy talked about some of this.
Yes, I think that there are a lot of areas for innovation in terms of just making the process easier, as we talked about, for not just the veteran, but for their families, their children, their spouses. Because we came back in Norfolk, many times they were at sea, they were on that carrier. And so the wife wanted to come and take courses. How do we make that easier for her, given children and other family obligations? And so we had to be really innovative in terms of putting the courses online and letting the spouses be able to go to those courses when it was easy for her to go or him to go, if the spouse was a female in SC. So we worked really hard doing those, and then opening up, like NATO, who was in Norfolk, as their North American headquarters. We had no relationship with them. And again, so we built internships, international, and these were first generation kids, again, who hadn't often been out of DC or Philadelphia until they came to Norfolk to go to college. So we worked very hard. And then with the veterans, many of them stay in the Tidewater area. They can work at the shipyard and other places with good careers. How do we get them to come back to school? So we made the faculty mobile. We started extending our courses off the campuses, on the bases, at different times to make it easier. And it has really worked well for the university. And these folks really identify, I think the chancellor talked about that last night. Now they connect to Norfolk State as a neat place to be and as their kind of alumni in a lot of ways.
That's great. Thank you, Mel. Ted, you started to foreshadow for us the system. You said Lincoln's doing fine, but I was wondering if you can give us a sense of how you're thinking about future enrollments, kind of with a 5 or 10-year outlook, given some of the demographic statistics that we heard about this morning in terms of both declining college age student groups, but also declining military age that are actually seeking that kind of an opportunity. How's the University of Nebraska system thinking about it?
Well, like a lot of universities, we're looking at data. We're looking at the changing demographics, not just nationally, but certainly in the state. Might surprise the audience to know that although Nebraska has slightly lagged the change in demographics of our nation, it's catching up. The Hispanic community in Nebraska is growing leaps and bounds. By the year 2040, the Hispanic community will represent over 30% of the entire state, which is remarkable. Now, that's not reflective in our enrollment today. The Yazidi population, that's a population of people that from northeastern Africa, they chose to live in Lincoln, Nebraska. It's the largest dense population of that group in the United States. And now their families are growing up and their children are ready for college. We have not moved dynamically enough to make sure that those underserved populations are ready to not only go to college, but be successful. When I led the Naval Academy, and again, you think superintendent for 5 years, how much can you really get done? One of the things we really wanted to tackle was make sure that we were representing the entire United States. We have a mandate to be representative of the entire United States. We had a high graduation rate when I got there in 2014, but it was mostly white males that were the highest graduation rate. So we went after that. And we wanted to make sure that as we were growing our women coming into the Naval Academy upwards of 30%, and the other demographics that were now rising, to the point where the white male became the minority by 2016 at the Naval Academy, first service academy to experience that. But more importantly, how did we make those populations have the same graduation rate and chance for success? We did 3 things, and I'm applying this at Nebraska. So the first thing is make sure that you have the right mentors. Young people have to see themselves and others to feel that they're successful. The second piece was to create a path for tutoring. And what was surprising to us it wasn't that the kids struggling with a 2.0 were using the tutors. It was the 4.0 students that were using it. So everybody used it. Those 2 things are very important. And then lastly, creating clubs and activities that are all-inclusive. In other words, if you join something within the institution, all of a sudden you feel like you belong. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, we went from gaps between prior enlisted, African-American midshipmen that were graduating in the 70% to now they were over 90% in just 2 years. We changed that quickly. So today, the graduation rate at Annapolis is about 91%. We're doing that now in Nebraska, but we're not moving fast enough. And why is this important? Because by the year 2030, 65% of all the jobs in the country, half of which haven't even been invented yet, are going to require a 4-year degree. In a state like Nebraska, where we graduate about 25,000 high school students a year, but yet we still have just something on the order of 300,000 of the working population that have some college degree, in a state that has 2.5% unemployment, we've got 80,000 jobs open. So there's a stated problem here that we, as the only university system, we're the only ones that can fix it. And it isn't that we're intended to be vocational, it's that we've got to work with the community colleges, the other trade schools to make sure that we get after this.
That's really helpful. Very helpful to understand the ability to apply across populations and using data to drive some of those decisions. Seth, I want to come back to you. I don't want to keep coming back to your opening framing, but your opening framing of the students at the University of Montana I thought was really interesting. And given that you taught economics, I'm going to put this question to you. So what are the differences in how you're thinking about non-traditional versus traditional students in economic terms at the University of Montana? And what should we be taking away from that as we think about the very purpose that we're here to discuss today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. We're thinking about it. And I think President Cutter, you framed it well, right? When you're on a college campus and you start talking about workforce needs, right? The first criticism, well, we're not a vocational school. Well, yes, we are, actually. Absolutely we are. And I bring it back to, look, our mission, I boil down to our campus, you can boil it down to 2 words, inclusive prosperity. And our job is to make sure that every single member of our community can reach their unique full potential, and that we are a driver of not just economic, but civic and cultural growth that is sustainable and inclusive. And so when we think about non-traditional learners, I mean, I think about it as an economic/business imperative for the university. I mean, we all see that demographic cliff that's coming. You combine a demographic cliff with a declining proportion of high school graduates who are going to college, that spells trouble for higher ed. Now, the flip side of that is I would argue that the demand for education and the need for education has never been higher in this country. The half-life of technical skills today is about 5 years. So if I go and I get, we all want to talk about STEM, that's great, but if I get the most up-to-date STEM degree, a year after I graduate, what I learned in my freshman year, half of it's obsolete. So this idea that education happens, you get a big dose of it from age 18 to 22, and then you're good for the next 30 years, so you get your watch and retire. That really existed for a very small sliver of the population ever, exists for almost no one now. And so what we're trying to do at the University of Montana is, how do we, again, broaden our aperture to include more diverse populations? Absolutely. But to look at people in the middle of their careers and say, how do we meet your learning needs? And I'll tell you what, it's not necessarily just with a 2-year or a 4-year degree. I often say to our school, we can't be the restaurant that just has a $50 all-you-can-eat buffet. When somebody says, I want a burger, and you say, oh yeah, we've got the burger. It's part of our $50 all-you-can-eat buffet. Or I want a slice of pie. And it's like, oh yeah, get our $50 buffet, and you can have a slice of pie. It's there. We need to say, no, I need to get that package of training that you need. And companies like GE can afford to pay for that. Companies like Nike, they have their own. Companies like JP Morgan, they what do they do with their recent finance graduates? They send them to 8 weeks of training to learn finance the JP Morgan way, right? Most companies and zero mom and pop businesses in Montana can afford that. So we're doing an active job of reaching out through an effort we called Accelerate Montana to partner directly with employers to say, what are your workforce and education needs and how can we meet them? And then we're trying to make that market, be that market maker, frankly, to provide transparency from the employer to the worker through a short, not 2 to 4 year, I'm talking 8 to 12 weeks, sometimes 3-month training program that meets that workforce needs. The difficulty is it's hard to do that in higher ed, so most of it's not for credit right now. Eventually, we're going to bridge to those being for-credit programs that get people on a pathway, but a different pathway to a 4-year degree, because we have to get people to those 4-year degrees. We just have to change I'll call them ways we access that demand for education.
So thank you so much. And Andy, you're going to get the last question before we go to the audience for Q&A, but you referenced earlier a partnership with Boeing, and I wonder if you can speak a bit more to some examples of the adaptations you're making to both recruiting and academic programming, and what you think some of those practices are that your wise counsel would be to consider.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a magic answer to this question, but to implement this type of vision, to grow our work in national security as a campus, it required a bunch of facets coming together. One is support from the state legislature, which we've gotten great support. The other is integration of our deans on campus to have a common story or a common vision about how each can contribute to this. And another element, of course, are the partnerships that exist, both with government agencies and also with private industry. And it's a bit of a leap of faith on all sides, right? But if you can cast the vision that it's a collective collaboration among all these players, you seem to get much greater interest from all players, because they say, I see that others are in this conversation as well. And so we've had great success doing that. I did want to add one other thing too when we talk about collaboration, and it's important to think about all the discussions that have happened in the wake of ChatGPT and artificial intelligence. We're kind of in this period where we don't really understand yet the full capability. Eric Schmidt and Huttenlocher and Kissinger wrote a book about this is the turning of humanity. We don't know. But higher ed has something to offer, of course, to this discussion, not just the technical piece, but the ethical and the legal and the moral pieces. And at the same time, the military has a vested interest, because the doomsday scenario of AI is that we're all going to just launch a war and AI is going to take over. So there's one area of collaboration that's timely and I think is probably dominating the importance level, at least in my book, and that is how do we partner with the DoD on issues of AI in the wake of the release of ChatGPT.
Andy, thank you so much. So for those of you who want to understand the book without reading the book, those 3 authors wrote a really good piece in the Weekend Wall Street Journal about a month ago.
That's great.
It too is a long read, but nothing as long as the book itself. We have about 13 minutes for Q&A, and so we'd love to open it up for discussion. So if you would just raise your hand, someone will bring you a microphone. If your question is a general question, then I'll ask the panelists just to field it. If your question's for a specific individual, please identify that individual. Yes, back here and then up here.
Gentlemen, thank you. In this context, specifically with military-connected families or military students, how do you think about your organizations competing against some of these predatory for-profit colleges or nonprofit colleges that have been shown to have relatively low returns on investment? We've talked about millions, or in some cases billions of dollars of tuition assistance, post-9/11 GI bills, essentially producing no benefit either to the veteran or for those still serving to their services.
Thank you. President Carter?
I'd love to take this on because this showed up on my doorstep at Nebraska almost the day I got there. First, we have a very robust online program like I know a lot of our universities do. I was paying very close attention to what Purdue and Purdue Global was doing, and there's a few others. And of course, having served in the military a long time, a lot of my sailors use Phoenix University. Some success, a lot not so much. Interestingly, if you're following all that, I would just say generically, I hate to generalize, the for-profits are going the way of the dinosaur. They're almost all gone. And Phoenix is selling itself. They approached me right away. I probably just broke a non-disclosure agreement.
Nobody would tell.
But I can say that because we didn't bite. And I told my team, I said, there's a space here that's necessary, and we've got to capitalize on it. And why were those things successful? Because the navigation of post 9/11 GI Bill, Yellow Ribbon programs, because I lived this with my family, was so extensive, they took all that away. They said, just push the easy button and we'll get your money, and then we're going to ask you for another bunch of money so that you might eventually graduate. And that's why they had a 10% graduation rate. So it was a horrible setup, but they did have something that was magical. And we've got to figure out how to make our own easy button so that our military families, active, can use our online programs. One of the best kept secrets at the University of Nebraska is not a university program I have. I actually have an online high school. It's one of the oldest in the country. It goes all the way back to the 1920s as a correspondence school. And with the advent of the internet, we took off. And although it was intended for farmers to use, that had to go across 2 time zone state. What we have found is that ambassadors, student athletes, performers have used this online high school because it has a reputation. It's very inexpensive, and we have Justin Timberlake and Britney Spears as 2 of our high school graduates. Now they don't want to do any PSAs for us, but we've tried that. But it's a credible program, and it's again, it does what some of the for-profits intend to do by actually delivering.
Sir?
So I don't work at the intersection of the military and education. I am retired military, so my question may be uninformed, just to give the preface. I understand military-connected families and veterans on campus. I understand the funnel for officers. But I think the problem is filling the enlisted ranks going forward and making sure we have enough war fighters to execute the mission. Is there a red thread between recruiting those enlisted young people that we need in our military and education that we've not talked about?
I absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll jump into it and y'all can join, and I think it goes both ways. I think there are programs that we need this is what I'm excited to talk about in the breakout sessions, and say, how do we provide a pathway for a student that says, you know what, if only 60% of American high school seniors are going on to higher ed, well, let's go get some job experience, right? Whether it's as an infantryman or in the Space Force or what have you, but then you have a pathway directly to college to get you, and you get credit for what you've done in the military. We need to crack that nut. It's not that hard. We need to do it. We haven't done it yet. Now on the military side, I think we need to be more creative. And one program I lived and experienced is the 18 X-ray program for Special Forces. In the Army, it was a direct entry for college graduates. And those of you who are not familiar, I don't know if it's still happening, but some of the best Green Berets in our unit were guys that, and they were all guys at that time, but one guy that was an All-American swimmer at USC, 18 X-ray straight into the Green Berets as an enlisted man, and then another one who played football at Georgetown. These are people who would not have come to the military otherwise, certainly would not have been in the enlisted ranks, but it was a creative program and brought us terrific service members. So I think it's kind of both ways.
I think that is one of the big misses in the high schools, because we talk now at the collegiate level about the debt that young men and women take to get through university. So if you can pitch these young men and women to go into the military, get your GI benefit, then come back to the university after having a good career and been exposed to the world in many instances, you have a very different student, more mature student who will probably persist to graduate, so you don't have to worry about the retention as much as you would if someone right out of high school, and they don't have to worry about the debt that they're accumulating like the traditional 18-year-old might be. So I think that is one of the big misses with high school counseling, because we try to launch everyone straight into a university now, and that is something we need to talk about. Because when you get the veterans to come back, like we were talking about at Syracuse and all these wonderful universities, they tend to persist to graduate. They can understand a little hardship and get through something rather than everything being a crisis. And it's just something I think we really ought to work on in the high schools to show this as a path to a very successful future and careers.
Great.
That's going to take effort. Can I make one 2-second point on this, because it's very tangible, and I want to tell you that culture in the high schools and in our communities, you know, that point of the lack of familiarity is a big deal. The chair of our faculty senate at the University of Montana, you know, PhD, anthropologist, public health expert, her son didn't feel like college was the right fit and was thinking about enlisting in the Air Force. Now, aside from going into the Air Force, which I thought was a little ill thought.
It's now come around.
I know. Well,
Is he an operations research analyst?
He's a crew chief for an F-22, I think. But it was really hard for her to wrap her head around it. It was hard for her, especially. So like, I can get, like, if you wanted to go to one of the academies or OTC, but enlisting, and I mean, I had to I take the personal time to sit with her and sit with her son and together. And she is, I mean, he's thriving. He's actually applying to the Air Force Academy. But that's a one-off.
Yeah.
And we have to somehow change the systems to make that a more viable and acceptable, I hate to have to use that word, but an acceptable pathway, because it's a great one.
I think I saw 3 hands back here. I saw one here, one here. Was there a third one, President Lamore? Oh, you have a microphone, so you get to go first.
All right, there's strategy here. Dean Van Slyke, thank you very much for moderating this great, rich dialogue. I'm deeply grateful. My question deals with ChatGPT AI, and I heard about a relationship with the DoD. I'm wondering if we could say a little bit more, if you would. On the one hand, AI is disrupting corporate America, higher education, and there's always a cost-benefit ratio, to be sure. I'm curious about how higher education could work with the DoD in this particular space, really to be collaborative as opposed to competitive. You assign it.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. Andy, do you want to start?
Since I brought it up, right? Well, I'm thinking of the positive things as well as the negative. I gave the worst case scenario, but when we think about our business processes within the DoD, certainly there are many things that we do on a daily basis that could be automated, and I think, not with ChatGPT, but other AI and digital tools can certainly help. So I think there's productive discussions. There's the AI Accelerator at MIT. It's the Air Force MIT AI Accelerator. So there's examples of those partnerships that already exist. But I think we shouldn't limit it to just the threat of war, but also how to operate more effectively and more efficiently. But then there's the existence questions, right? The big questions, and having the deep thinkers in philosophy and ethics and law talking about, and politics, talking about that informs with DoD leaders, I think, is vital.
Anyone else? Ted?
I'll just say briefly, the cat's out of the bag. I mean, it's out there. People are using it. And it hasn't been taxi tested enough, certainly for a military application. I could tell you stories of flying in combat where I made a decision to not drop a weapon on the last second for ethical reasons, that if there was an artificial intelligence mechanism built into my airplane, it most likely would have dropped the weapon and caused catastrophic civilian casualties. So we're not there yet, and it's being studied. It'll be studied at all the service academies and at the war colleges. I worry, personally. I see great advantage to having it, but when it comes to the man or woman on the battlefield, the human brain is still too complicated to be replicated through artificial intelligence.
No?
No, I'm good.
Seth, anything else on that?
I mean, I just think, look, technology is going to continue to adapt. How do we train people to utilize technology in the most effective ways? And I think it goes back to how do we create, and this is why the 4-year education, I am an evangelist, because in a world in which everything that can be automated will be automated, what should we be doing for young people today? Well, training and honing their uniquely human capacities of creative thinking, of problem solving, of teamwork, of communication, the people that can use those tools to greatest effect. I mean, having worked led a technology business that automated the way trains drive across this country, the technical skills are infinitely scalable. What's not are the human skills to use those technologies in both ethical and effective ways.
Seth, I think your point is right on. Syracuse University has a pretty unique autonomous systems policy institute that really is about adaptation, right? So it's not just that the technology is crowding out the need for humans, right? It's our demand is now at a much higher level. And much like you were saying before, it's not just vocationalizing what education is. It is that critical thinking, that analytical reasoning, that ethical understanding and consideration. So I think these are great points. We have exactly 1 minute left, and I know that Vice Chancellor Haney wants us to end right on time. I think we have a question right here. Yep. So you'll have to be really parsimonious with your question.
The question I've got is, you might have seen the American Council on Education release their survey of presidents last week. It looks like the tenure is, what's that?
It's on now.
Okay. It looks like the tenure of presidents is down and expected to accelerate in the coming years. This kind of collaboration, this kind of system change requires strong and creative leadership. How are you building sustainability into these kind of programs at universities, and how would you see that happening elsewhere?
Well, I can answer that first. I'm already toast. Because I had enough to say for a specific period of time. But I just think the demand on the job is what drives this 24/7 concept now. Just drives, maybe people to make different decisions over time.
I know we only have a couple seconds. When I got hired at the University of Nebraska, one of the things I said is I can come into this job and be apolitical because I was for 38 years wearing the cloth of the nation. What you're seeing with the departure of so many university presidents is the friction that's being created through culture wars, what's happening on boards, whether they be governor elected, publicly elected, and universities presidents saying, I can't deal with this. I just came out of COVID, and then you're going to throw all this and then try to legislate what I can or cannot do. Academic freedom's under attack. You name it. We have to figure out a way how to concentrate on 3 things in higher ed right now. And I believe in this. And I think military background makes us very suitable to be university presidents. First, we got to focus on education. Education. We got to teach. And that's what we got to do. Second, meaningful research at the national and state level, whatever level, global level. And third, attract and retain faculty. If we do those things in higher ed, a lot of the rest of this stuff will become a little bit less heavyweight, and you'll find university presidents hanging around a little bit longer.
Please join me in thanking these great panelists.